Welcome, everyone, to CIFAR's series of virtual talks and today's conversation with Stephen Reicher. These online talks are intended to showcase how research conducted by CIFAR's fellows can help inform decision-making as governments develop policies to reopen shuttered societies and economies in the wake of COVID-19. If you're not familiar with us, CIFAR is a Canadian-based global research organization that convenes extraordinary minds from around the world to address some of the most important questions facing science and humanity. Like many other organizations, CIFAR has pivoted quickly to take action on COVID-19, launching new projects and initiatives, some of which we're highlighting through this series. My name is Kate Geddie. I'm a Senior Director of Research at CIFAR, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Stephen Reicher today. Steve is a professor of psychology at the University of St. Andrews and a leading authority on social psychology. His work focuses on questions of social identity, collective behavior, crowd behavior, and leadership. And he is a fellow in CIFAR's new Boundaries, Membership, and Belonging Research Program. In recent months, Steve has served on behavioral science advisory groups to both the Scottish and UK governments concerning the responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And despite how busy that must have kept him, he has amazingly managed to co-author a book that was published in late May titled Together Apart, The Psychology of COVID-19. Given the intense interest in this topic, then and now, it was published at that time online as an uncorrected proof. The premise of the book is that unless or until a vaccine for the coronavirus is developed, our means of controlling the spread of infection depend on behavioral changes and hence upon human psychology. So in today's webinar, Steve will share with us insights from this book that uses social identity theorizing to analyze the psychology of the COVID-19 pandemic, such as what encourages us to come together and support one another as a community to help us through the crisis. Before we dive in, I'll quickly set the parameters for today's session, which will last 30 minutes. I'll take my advantage of position as host to ask Steve the first few questions before opening it up to questions from you, the online participants. So if you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And lastly, I'll mention that the session is being recorded and will be available on the CIFAR website next week. So welcome, Steve. Thanks very much.
Hi.
To start our conversation, what is the field of social psychology and why is it particularly important to understand identity and group processes under the current pandemic?
Okay. Well, let me start. Well, I'm not sure whether I'm correcting you or correcting myself because you were citing something that I said about behavior being at the center of this until we get a vaccine. Actually, it's going to be at the center of this even when we have a vaccine, because a vaccine does not stop the infection. People getting vaccinated does, and people have got to therefore be willing to be vaccinated. And the latest polling evidence I saw showed that something like a third of people are saying they wouldn't take such a vaccine. So there's a huge behavioral question there. Or equally, if we discuss masks, say, there's a lot of discussion, do masks stop the infection? Well, masks stop nothing. Wearing a mask might. And again, we're talking about behaviors. We're talking about whether people wear them, how they wear them, how effectively they wear them. And most obviously with lockdown. Lockdown as a policy does nothing unless people agree to be locked down. So right at the core of every intervention we have, including when we have a vaccine, is dependent upon behavior and human behavior. Now, through this pandemic, there have been two very different approaches to human behavior and two ways of thinking about the place of the public in the pandemic response. One is a very traditional view, and it's a rather elitist view, and it's a view that has at its core a notion that human beings are essentially psychologically frail. We have a tenuous grasp on reality. We are full of biases. We have a tenuous moral compass, which is easily thrown aside. And that fragility is, if you like, exacerbated under conditions, A, where we're in the group still further undermines our rationality, and secondly, when there's a crisis. And that's exemplified by the notion of panic. The notion is that in a crisis, people panic A Hollywood disaster film would never be complete without a scene of people running away, screaming, waving their hands in the air, and clogging up the exit. So it's human psychology and the frailty of the human subject which turns a crisis into a tragedy, and therefore a public or a real problem. Now, when you look more closely at crises, actually that's not what you find. What you find on the whole is actually people behave in a fairly restrained way. They support each other, they don't just look after themselves, and they are rather resilient. When it happens, every nation thinks, oh, there's something special about us because we behaved in a restrained and a supportive way. So in Britain, we like to think it's the Blitz spirit. That's what does it. We're different from the rest of you. If you go to New York, they'll tell you it's the New York spirit. You saw it in 9/11. Actually, it happens nearly everywhere. The reason why it happens is that when we have common fate, when we face a common predicament, what we see is the emergence of a shared identity, a sense of us. And that sense of us, that extension of the self to include others, has a number of consequences, including support for others, coordination with others, and therefore with others, working with others, when others become an asset to us rather than a problem, actually we become psychologically resilient, we become empowered, and we become rather effective. And what we've seen in this pandemic in many countries, certainly we saw it in the UK, I think you saw it in Canada as well, is that when that shared sense of identity is understood, when it is nurtured by leadership, when it is scaffolded by policies which bring people together, then actually the public develop a sense of collective resilience. And that sense of collective resilience is in many ways the best asset you have in a pandemic. And so just to finish this comment with, for me, if I had a top 10 quotes of the pandemic, I'm sure there will be lists like that in Sunday magazines in years to come. My number one would be Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, who said, it's not about I, it's about we. Get your head around the we concept. And what my work has tried to do for many years is to try and understand the we concept. I call it social identity, but we concept will do, and understand how it can be developed and harnessed and how the group becomes the asset rather than the problem in a pandemic.
That's interesting. Well, I'd like to pick up on the theme that you mentioned around the role of political leaders and suggesting that they have a critical role in fostering necessary group behaviors and dealing with a health emergency. What do we know about what's needed in terms of effective political leadership in an emergency situation like a pandemic?
Well, let me start with the concept of leadership itself. And since you plugged the Together Apart book, also this week we released with my colleague Alex Haslam and Michael Plato a book on leadership. So leadership is something that interests me. And when you look at traditional notions of leadership, they are, again, very hierarchical and very elitist. And they start from the premise that what makes a great leader is what sets them apart from the rest of us. You know, the great leader has these amazing qualities, and if only you could understand what it was, if you could isolate this right stuff and bottle it, you would have solved the problem of leadership. Now, the problem with that, well, it has many problems. First of all, it ignores the fact that leaders, again, don't achieve anything on their own. They achieve it through followers. So leadership, which ignores followers, is an empty model. Empirically, I mean, that notion of it is highly gendered, great man leadership has been around for a long time. Thomas Carlyle famously in, I think it was about 1848, his book on heroes and hero worship said that history is effectively what great men have done while they were on earth. Thousands of studies trying to find empirically what is the quality that shows leadership. And they've all failed. And they failed because actually they missed the point that what makes a great leader is what actually brings them together with the group they seek to lead. What makes them able to represent that group, speak for that group, shape the understanding of the group. So what the qualities that you need in a leader aren't abstract or absolute. it's more a matter of a fit between our understanding of who we are and the leaders' definition of who they are. And leaders, we call them entrepreneurs of identity, are very skilled at telling a narrative of the group and a narrative of themselves, which fleshes those two together. And particularly what you need in a pandemic is you need a sense of shared identity. You need to nurture that sense of usness. You need to bring people together to support each other, and actually to do the practical things, but also to provide the psychological support to take us through. Now, if one of the criteria for being an effective leader is to create a unified group, then we see huge differences between different leaders in different places. I think the leaders we've seen who are effective, so for instance, Jacinda Ardern, perhaps, in New Zealand. Luckily enough, I don't live in England, I live in Scotland, so we've seen it with Nicola Sturgeon. Actually, it's quite interesting, when you name the leaders, you see they have something in common. They tend to be women, but these are leaders who have been very effective in nurturing a sense of us and in representing that sense of us, and also, of course, in developing the policies which support the collective self-interest. But again, let me make a point here. It's a simple point, but actually it's a rather consequential point. In so much of our social science, we start from the premise that individuals act in terms of individual self-interest. And the way to motivate people is to tell them what is in their individual self-interest. The problem with that, again, is it equates the self with the individual. It ignores the fact that we can define ourself in collective terms. And it ignores the fact that actually in the pandemic, what is important is we don't act for ourselves as individuals, but we act for the community. So very simply, if people were acting in terms of individual self-interest, a hell of a lot of people in this pandemic would say to themselves, actually, if I do the cost-benefit analysis, I lose more by staying in than by going out. If you're young and you're healthy, actually, you don't have much to risk by going out, and you lose a hell of a lot by staying in. I have a 16-year-old next door who is not very happy about having to stay in. He suffers far more than I do. Okay? So on the basis of individual self-interest, your calculation would say go out. But of course, at a collective level, if you go out, you spread the disease, other people get ill and die. So if you want to contain the pandemic, people need to be thinking of themselves in terms of that collective identity. And by and large, that's what happened. So for instance, I know the UK data, there may well be data in Canada as well, but it shows that actually the main factor which determined whether people obeyed lockdown or not was not their sense of individual risk, it was their sense of communal risk, their sense of community identity. So again, understanding the we concept, creating a sense of us and representing that sense of us is absolutely central to leadership. However, and actually here, I could try and show how much I know about Canada, but I know nothing about Canada. But luckily, Kate, you said, yeah. And I read about Bonnie Henry, and I loved her quotation about we're all in the same storm, we're not in the same boats. And the problem is, it's all very well to talk the talk of shared identity and to talk the talk of an inclusive sense of usness. But of course, different people within the national community are in very different positions and are affected very differently by the pandemic. It's opened up and shone a spotlight on all our inequalities. And therefore, part of creating a shared identity is not only to do it rhetorically, but to do it practically. The practical economic measures of, for instance, supporting people so that they can afford to stay at home, giving money for those who are unemployed, giving money for those who are self-employed, and so on. And only if in practice you create the conditions for a shared experience and a shared response, will you be able to create that shared identity? So as I say, it's a matter of rhetoric, but it's also a matter of practical policy, which means that we're not only in the same storm, but we are, at least to some extent, in the same boat.
Well, so now that it's been almost 4 months, at least in Canada, since the major COVID-19 restrictions were put in place, we're hearing more and more reference to things like quarantine fatigue.
Mm.
Is there evidence that there are potential limits to our psychological ability to put up with restrictions?
You see, this was a huge controversy in the UK, and before we locked down, we had people talking about behavioural fatigue, and they actually used it to justify a delay in lockdown in the UK, and that arguably that could have cost tens of thousands of lives. I mean, depending on how you calculate it, I mean, you've lost about 8,000 lives from what I can see. In Canada, we've lost about 60,000. We've done pretty badly, and this notion of behavioural fatigue, if it led to a delay, it's a big issue. Okay, now, when you look at the notion of fatigue, it is perfectly true that it is difficult to sustain lockdown over a prolonged period. So the fact that there is fatigue and compliance decreases, I think, is not controversial. What is controversial is what is the root of that fatigue? Is it an essential psychological fragility, and that takes me back to what I was saying about different psychological models, or is it something else? So let me give you just one, I think, very striking piece of evidence. Again, I apologise, it's British evidence, but I suspect it's the same in different places. In the UK, you found a difference of a factor of 6 between the most affluent and the least affluent in how often they went out under lockdown. Okay, there's a huge difference in compliance. But when you looked at motivation, when you looked at the psychological will to stay in, there was no difference between those groups at all. The difference lay in just basically the ability to stay at home and put food on the table. So there are a couple of factors which are absolutely critical in determining your ability to go along with something. One is, of course, the information you're given. People might suffer for a cause, but if there's no cause to suffer for, people aren't going to suffer for it. So if the messaging is bad, and if the messaging suggests to you, oh, well, actually, it's all over, there's no danger, then people won't comply. So failures of government messaging, and we've seen that in the UK, undermine compliance. And the second thing is practical. If people can't afford to stay at home and feed their families, they won't do so. So to my mind, the evidence for the psychological fragility is actually rather weak. People showed incredible resilience under lockdown. I mean, again, in the UK, the figures showed that something like 44% of people were suffering, but they still stayed in. I think this has undermined those notions of fragility and showed collective resilience when people work together. The problems, as I say, have been those of messaging, and our government has been very bad at this, and of giving practical support. And so to talk about fatigue being a psychological problem in many ways for me is the government blaming its own failures on the failure of human psychology. And I think that's a very dangerous as well as a very unfair thing to do.
So, as I mentioned at the outset, you've been advising both the Scottish and UK governments on how to encourage adherence to public health behaviours. In a previous CIFAR webinar, we had one of our other fellows, Tim Besley, who's part of our Institutions, Organisations and Growth programme, who spoke to the government use of research evidence for policy making. This seems to be a particularly political issue in the UK right now. Can you tell us why and how you feel government should use insights from academic research, both to guide the pandemic response, but also a post-pandemic recovery?
So I think the responsibility is always around. And I mean, academics have got to be open about the limits of what we know and the certainties of our own evidence. And clearly, given that COVID-19 is new and we're learning things about it all the time, both in epidemiological terms, but also in psychological terms, there are certain things we couldn't know yet. We have some general principles that we could apply. And there, I think one of the benefits of psychological research is that on the whole, we do try and understand, if you like, general processes of behavior. So I can speak for instance, to the role of social identities and social norms in behavior, and then I can apply that to the particular types of identities you draw on, or the particular types of norms which is necessary to reconfigure in order to get behavior. So I think we have to be, as I say, open about our own limitations. And then from the perspective of government, I think there are two pitfalls. One being to ignore the science, because the science, of course, can tell you what the consequence of particular actions will be. But the other error, and I think it's equally problematic, is to claim to be led by the science. Because if the science can tell you what particular outcomes are likely to be, what it can't do is tell you, how much risk should you or shouldn't you take? Or how do you balance different risks against each other? Because that's a political question, or a value question, if you like. And to claim that you are led by the science can sometimes hide the political choices, which I think is dangerous and disingenuous. So I think it's very important to get the balance right, and to say that government should listen to us, and governments should be informed by the science, but government should not be led by the science. And if they claim that they are led by the science, what they're trying to do is to hide their own political choices, and therefore their political accountability behind the science. And then, of course, what comes next when things have gone wrong is to blame the science for the political choices that they made. And I see signs of that happening in the UK.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, for sharing your insights with us. We've got just, I think, a little under 10 minutes left, so I'm going to turn to some of the questions that have come in from our audience. So one question is that, so the person has written in that they find one of the most challenging parts of COVID-19 is that the effects are delayed, that there's a 2-week delay period between infection and symptoms, and it's hard to know which types of personal protective measures are effective. How is human psychology adapted to dealing with this kind of delay between actions and consequences?
Yeah, well, first of all, of course, the asymptomatic transmission issue we've discovered is one of the most significant issues of COVID, and it's what makes it actually such a dangerous disease, because a lot of people who don't know that they are ill are going out and shedding the virus. That's one of the reasons. People thought that the major parameters were, if you like, how infectious it was and how many people it killed, but the delay is critical to the epidemiology. It's also critical to issues like why we should wear masks, because a lot of the time we can spread the disease without knowing that we are spreading the disease. There is, a lot of research in psychology about delayed gratification and about temporality and so on. I think also, again, actually what it comes down to is clarity about understanding and clarity about messaging. And it comes back to actually an even broader issue. If you want to ask, how are authorities effective? And why people comply with authorities, the literature tends to suggest that it's not to do with authorities being able to punish you, but you having a sense of the authorities acting for you and the authorities being on your side. And so work on procedural justice says, if you want people to go along with authorities, in many ways treat them as you would a member of your own group, treat them as a partner. And part of doing that means being open with people. It means respecting people. It means giving people all the information that they need. And one of the dangers of this fragility notion is that if you give people too much information, they'll panic. So we will hide the complexities from people because they're not up to it. My sense is that people are fully able to understand these things as long as a government has an adult conversation with people, respects people, and provides a clear mental model of the nature of the disease. And so to me, this is very much not an issue of psychological limitations, it's an issue of the problems of the psychological government's models which authority has, and it's an issue of clarity of communication, giving us a clear mental model, and part of that mental model is an understanding that we've got to act as if we've got the virus, even when we haven't. And we've got to take the precautions as if we could have the virus, even when we don't. And so I think those forms of communication become an absolutely central issue.
Do you think there'll be a lasting effect on social interactions, even after the vaccine's developed and deployed?
See, the paradox of that question, I think, is, so there's all this debate about, how will society change? Well, the problem is that if you think that societies are going to inevitably change in particular ways, you don't fight for those changes, you become passive, which means that they're less likely to happen. So that's the paradox. Paradox is, the more you say this is going to happen, the less likely it is to happen. For me, I look at it slightly differently. I say, what has this pandemic shown us? And I think it's shown us two very clear things. First of all, of course, it's shone a spotlight on inequalities of certainly of race and ethnicity, certainly of class, certainly of gender, of generation as well. It has shown us how pernicious they are. It has shown us how murderous they are. Things that people knew before, but it's become blindingly obvious. And it's also shown us that the response when people are angry at those inequalities is not repression, that simply leads to social disorder. It's to acknowledge, address, and to change. And so I hope that that vision, both of the inequalities and of the inadequacy of a repressive response, will empower us to struggle for a more equitable society. The second thing it's shown us, and in the sense that's been at the core of what I've been saying, is it changes our understanding of the relationship between the individual and the collective in a quite profound way. We've always been told the individual is relatively rational and the group is bad for us. And it's an idea that came out in the period of industrialization, basically because of elite fear of the masses. What we've seen in this pandemic is the power of the group. Now, of course, that power can be used in bad ways. And we see that in pandemics. We see at times, we see prejudice, we see pogroms in pandemics, but it can be used positively. Like dynamite, it can be a destructive power, it can be a constructive power. I think understanding the power of the collective and the fact that the collective is not less rational than the individual is a profound change for our social sciences. And it raises questions, of course, about the relationship between the individual and the state. And perhaps the state needs to abandon its paternalistic notion that people are irrational and needs the state to look after them, and change it to, if you like, a notion that the state has to scaffold the collective self-organization of people. It's not a cheap option. It's not an option for budget cuts, because actually self-organization requires resources. It requires funds. But certainly, I think there are some profound visions we've had, but they are visions that give us a notion of what we want to get. They're not going to happen automatically, and they're things that are going to have to be fought for.
I'm looking at time, and I'm trying to decide if I can squeeze in one more question. It relates to the fact that we all likely have multiple overlapping kinds of group identity, and one of which may be affiliation with different political parties. How, particularly in Canada, the US, and the UK, political party affiliation can be quite a strong element of identity. Are there opportunities here to strengthen solidarity or to improve adherence to public health measures along political party lines?
I mean, here again, I think leadership is absolutely critical. I mean, you can have polarizing leadership. And in fact, I mean, to me, what's happened in the United States is quite extraordinary. I mean, one has a president who positions himself as the anti-political president and who is as an insurgent. Even in office, the office of the President of the United States acts as an insurgent and encourages people to act in anti-state ways, encourages people to violate lockdown, encourages people to protest and even be violent against those who are taking public health measures. You can have a deeply polarizing leadership. I think you've seen it in other countries as well. So I think, for instance, in India, we saw it to some extent, and the ways in which it was used to pursue a Hindu nationalist agenda and to talk, for instance, about corona jihadism, to blame Muslims. So I think bad leadership in a pandemic is really the worst of all worlds and can divide people. But where there has been good inclusive leadership, as I say, which goes along with the measures that bring people together, then yes, I think we've seen extraordinary levels of unity and extraordinary levels of support. So again, we sometimes think of contexts automatically changing human behavior. No, it's the way in which contexts are understood and made sense of. It's the interaction between the structure of experience and leadership and the structure of rhetoric which determines outcomes. It's not inevitable, it's not deterministic, it's the intersection of the political and the psychological which answers those questions.
Well, that is all the time that we have for today, unfortunately. Thank you to all who are joining us from home, and a huge thank you to you, Stephen Reicher, for sharing your insights with us. Please visit our website at CIFAR.ca to find out more about these series and to view a recording of this talk, which should be posted early next week.
Could I make one final point, if I may, which is that the book which we wrote, we wrote in order to be as broadly available as possible. So it is available as a free download. It doesn't cost you anything. You can buy it as a paperback, but it's a free download. So if you go to look up Together Apart, that's the name of the book, you can have it for free, and you can see some of the literature and the evidence that lies behind some of the things I've been saying.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Steve.
Thank you.